We're actually working with someone where we're going to pull this all together into a report that we'll put out probably in late January, just telling people what were the common themes we heard across the country. So this will be a basis for what we're doing with the strategy. It's what just average people, people living with HIV, service providers, but also faith leaders, business leaders, really everybody has sort of come together and said these are the important things that we think you need to consider. Every president since President Reagan has relied on a presidential advisory council on HIV and AIDS, and President Obama will continue to do that. We announced in August that Dr. Helene Gayle is going to chair this council, and we're in the process of reviewing a slate of candidates, and I actually hope in the near future to be able to announce a new council. We're very excited about the diversity of voices and people that have stepped forward and are interested in serving, and we think it'll be a very fruitful way to get input from the public, both as we develop this strategy, but also once we have this national strategy, they're going to be a good tool for monitoring the implementation and make sure that we live up to the goals that we set. The basic way, though, that we're developing this strategy is through a federal interagency process. So I'm going to be convening people from all across the federal government. And when I think about this, I think this is important for a couple reasons. One, it can't just exist in the Department of Health and Human Services. They'll have a key role. But a national strategy must include HUD and deal with housing issues. You know, as I've traveled the country and heard from people, I'm still shocked in some ways, quite honestly, at the level of discrimination and stigma faced by people with HIV/AIDS. And in some cases, I've heard of just clearly illegal behavior. So we have to engage the Department of Justice. But we also have to engage the Department of Labor. We want to engage them broadly. Now, some of the community advocates have said that they wish that they weren't as engaged or that we had a bigger role for the community. And I sort of jokingly tell them that, you know, I know in my role I could get anybody, any federal employee to come to a meeting with me, but they'll smile and they'll say, yeah, I'll be here when you're gone. But to me, it's important that we engage them in a meaningful way because I want them to own this strategy. And once this document is developed, we're going to turn to these agencies and expect them to deliver results for us. So we've been doing these community discussions. We'll wrap up this weekend. We've also been holding a series of expert meetings at the White House. Last week, we had the most exciting meeting on youth and HIV, and we brought together 35 youth from across the country, youth leaders. Roughly about half or so, I'd say, were HIV-positive youth. It was just incredible to see the seriousness with which they came and shared their ideas. We had a meeting this week on women in HIV, well, ranging from women living with HIV, academic experts, but we're also joined by the President's Senior Advisor, Valerie Jarrett, our new Surgeon General, Dr. Regina Benjamin, who told of their personal and professional commitment. Next week, we're doing a meeting on housing and HIV. So these things are all feeding into gathering a lot of information for this strategy. We've also contracted with the Institute of Medicine to look at some key policy issues. This won't happen on a timeline for developing the strategy, but you know, there's critical questions we have about the role of HIV testing. How can we broaden testing? If we test a lot of people and want to get them into care, do we have the workforce or the capacity to provide care? So they're going to be looking at things. We've been in a phase of information gathering, really from about August through the end of this month. The first quarter of next year is really where you're going to see our efforts to synthesize this, working with this interagency group, the President's Advisory Council and others, and really develop a strategic plan for the nation. Once we have this, I can't give you an exact date, but in the early part of next year we'll have this strategy. Then we're going to turn and come up with an ongoing monitoring and implementation process. You know, I mentioned that before I started that I know I'll have more people disappointed than will be happy. I just feel like it's the nature of the job. I also have been around Washington long enough to know that sometimes you work for years for something and then what you get at the end of the day, it's watered down and you feel like, well, was it worth it? This strategy won't solve all our problems. It won't make AIDS go away in this country. But I think having this president that's given us a space to do this and he'll take it really seriously, at this point in time we have a real opportunity for the HIV community, but really for the nation to really step forward in a collective way to really recommit ourselves to ending the domestic HIV epidemic. So I'm excited while I'm daunted about this challenge. But with that, I just want to say thank you for listening to me, and it's a pleasure to join you here today.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday Forum featuring Director of the Office of National AIDS Policy, Jeffrey Crowley. We will return to our speaker in a minute for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions now and remind you that they should be brief and to the point. We welcome you to this City Club Forum. Our greeting goes to those present in this room and especially to those who are guests. We hope you will join the City Club and become active in our ongoing civic dialogue. We welcome guests at tables hosted by the AIDS Task Force of Greater Cleveland, Baker Hostetler, the Collaborative for Comprehensive School Age Health, the George Gunn Foundation, and the United Church of Christ. Thank you for joining us today. Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Director of Development, Jessica Leary Allen, and PR and Programs Manager, Carrie Miller. First question, please.
Good afternoon. One of the target areas that you haven't mentioned that I'm wondering if you're looking into and if you have any thoughts on are incarcerated populations. I'm a lawyer with the ACLU, and we frequently hear of complaints of individuals who are incarcerated and their HIV treatment care isn't being met. For example, medications aren't being administered properly, especially when they're first transitioning into the incarcerated environment. Is that something you're looking at, and do you have any thoughts on how we can address that treatment care need?
You do raise an important question about how we deal with the incarcerated. I don't have the answers for you yet, but I think we need to grapple with them. I think there's a couple of questions. Are we providing adequate care and treatment in prisons? You know, there's complex issues about protecting their confidentiality. You know, there are some prison systems in the country where HIV-positive individuals are still segregated. Does that make sense? But also we know we need to do a much better job when people transition out. You know, I've heard horror stories where people, you know, they're adherent in care in prison, then they're discharged with not even a day's supply of drugs and, you know, no place to live. The other things we need to deal with is just looking at transmission patterns in communities where there are high rates of incarceration. Some people think that, you know, people are getting HIV in prison, then they're going out. But there's also things going on when maybe your partner is left behind in a community. They're contracting HIV, but we know that incarceration itself is very disruptive to communities. And so I think there's a lot of work that we need to do, and we welcome thoughts and suggestions for how we can address this. But we do know it's a tough issue, but something we need to grapple with.
What is the role of sex education in the schools in HIV prevention? And also, is there any data from countries that have more substantial sex education programs on their effectiveness?
Well, your second question, is there data from other countries? I'm just not the person to answer that. I think it's something we could look at. You know, sex ed in schools is an important thing. I mean, I think that before this administration, you know, we spent a lot of money on absence-only education. That was a very controversial issue. And I think the way this president approached that is that one of the good things about funding absence-based programs is it brought a lot of new stakeholders to the fight against HIV. But the other thing that I think President Obama believes is that we must make sure our programs are scientifically accurate and evidence-based. And so what we proposed is to continue the funding we had provided for this education, but ensure that it's evidence-based and comprehensive. It looks like we're in a process, we're about to get a budget. It looks like the Congress largely adopted our proposal. But we also believe that we don't want to lose all the other stakeholders. So if there's faith-based groups that are engaged in HIV prevention, we want to keep them engaged as much as possible. But a bottom line issue is that we must be funding the programs that we know that work. What we did with our budget is said that of the pool of funds, about 3/4 can only be used for evidence-based programming. And we really believe that the evidence-based only exists for really comprehensive initiatives. But we also recognize that I think there's only evidence for about 20 or so specific programs. We don't think that's enough. So the other quarter, or 25% of our funding, would go to experimental ideas. And you could test a wide range of ideas.